My husband proposed an open marriage after 32 years. Little did he know I was plotting my escape. Margaret had always considered her life a quiet tapestry of small, steady moments woven together over more than 3 decades. The gentle rhythm of her days in the modest neighborhood where she and David had raised their children was as familiar as the morning sunlight filtering through their kitchen window. It was the light she woke up to every day, baking bread and preparing coffee with a practiced ease that gave the house an effortless warmth. For Margaret, stability was sacred, a precious certainty amidst the unpredictable tides of the world. She had put her heart and soul into her family, tending to her husband and children like a gardener nurturing a fragile rose bush, steady hands pruning, watering, always hoping for full bloom. The years hadn't been perfect. No marriage ever was. But hers was built on a foundation she believed unshakable, carved from shared histories, quiet sacrifices, and dreams spoken in whispers during late-night talks. The day everything shifted slipped into her hands almost unnoticed, a casual evening that bloomed into shattering confession. David's voice was calm, but different. There was an edge of anticipation that pressed down the room like humidity before a thunderstorm. "I've been thinking," he started, eyes skimming over the worn lines of their wedding photos on the wall. "Maybe we should open the marriage." Those words, they landed like a splash of cold water, sending a shock through her chest, and somewhere between confusion and disbelief, her breath caught, her hands trembling with a secret tremor she tried to hide. 32 years had passed with joint prayers, shared burdens, laughter, and tears. Yet now, this stranger in the man she thought she knew proposed something so foreign, so raw. The idea didn't just crack her world, it cracked her open, revealing a hollowed chamber she hadn't known existed. Margaret swallowed hard, blinking away the sharp sting gathering in her eyes. The weight of those words was a slow erosion, a silent humiliation that crept into every corner of her self-worth. She sat frozen beneath the glow of the single lamp, the shadows tracing her quiet despair like barbed vines. Somehow, in those moments, years of devotion felt invisible, swept aside like dust. The very thought that David could seek freedom beyond their vows, beyond her, stirred a tempest of questions she couldn't voice, questions that hammered against her ribcage, unrelenting. Could their love, or what she believed it was, survive this fracture? Did she still matter in the same way? Or was she now just a memory he'd outgrow? The days that followed were a quiet torment. David spoke of boundaries, excitement, and exploring desires he'd long repressed. But Margaret saw only the widening gap, the distance it put between them, like a chasm filled with cold silence and unspoken fear. The neighborhood, once a haven where she waved to familiar faces through lace curtains and exchanged smiles over freshly mowed lawns, felt suddenly suffocating, like walls closing in. At the grocery store, when whispering voices drifted to her ears, when neighbors' eyes darted away shyly, she felt smaller, as if invisible, diminished in a world that had suddenly decided she no longer belonged in the light. The bitter taste of humiliation lingered, silent but oppressive, and with it, a gnawing fear that her years of fidelity had been taken for granted, or worse, discarded like some worn garment. One evening, the sting was tangible when she stumbled upon David's phone left unguarded on the kitchen counter. A message chimed softly, a name she didn't recognize, paired with words that spilled secrets she wished she could unsee. Plans for a secret rendezvous, affection borrowed from the brightness of someone new. Margaret's hands curled into fists, nails digging shallow crescents into her skin as her heart pounded fiercely, feeling the sharp barbs of betrayal pierce deeper than any spoken word could. She pictured the woman on the other end, young, laughing, untouched by the years and memories shared in the quiet corners of Margaret's life. It was a cruel reminder of where she stood now, pushed aside, a ghost of the woman who once held the center of David's world. In the solitude that followed, she sank into her favorite chair by the window, her breath shallow, tears hovering on the edge before falling like fragile beads onto a threadbare blanket draped across her lap. The room was still, except for the ticking clock, marking time she felt slipping away, time in which she needed to make a choice. Be consumed by the humiliation that threatened to swallow her whole, or find a spark within herself to fight back. The questions churned in her mind like a storm she couldn't quiet. Who was she now, without the marriage that defined her? Had her own identity been lost beneath the weight of David's desires she never saw coming? Even in her grief, a sliver of something stubborn glowed, an ember of resistance. Margaret knew this moment wasn't just the end of a chapter. It held the raw material of rebirth. She wondered quietly, almost afraid to voice it aloud, what steps she might take to reclaim her life. Could she build a new identity on the ruins of the past? Or would the echoes of this betrayal define her forever? She looked out the window into the fading light of dusk. Streets lined with familiar faces, stories unfolding, lives continuing. And she asked herself gently, what if this humiliation is the beginning of my own secret strength? As the night deepened, her fingers absent-mindedly traced the worn wooden armrest of the chair, and in that simple touch, there was a promise to herself. This was not the end. And maybe, just maybe, the real journey was about to begin here. Have you ever faced a moment that shattered your world but held the faintest promise of new beginnings? If so, take a moment to reflect on the courage it takes to rise again. The days that followed Margaret's shattering discovery felt like waves crashing relentlessly against a fragile shore, each one eroding more of her sense of security and self. David moved through their home with an unsettling newfound ease, as if the proposal of an open marriage had lifted a secret weight from his shoulders. His laughter, once shared warmly with her over morning coffee, now felt hollow, detached, echoing in rooms where silence should have reigned. The neighbors began to notice subtle changes, the way Margaret's smiles sometimes flickered uncertainly before fading, the slight slump of her shoulders, the quiet conversations held late at night, with tears dabbling the edges of her wasted resolve. But Margaret's true humiliation struck in the most painful moments, moments etched with the cruel clarity of everyday interactions that became walls closing in on her already bruised heart. At a community gathering, she overheard David animatedly recounting stories filled with flirtations and possibilities, a reckless candor that sent a cold stab through her chest. His words were soaked in excitement, effortlessly painting futures where she occupied a shadowed corner of his life rather than its center. Friends and acquaintances, who once greeted them as a united couple, now exchanged curious glances, some pitying, some judgmental, and others offhandedly suggesting that perhaps it was time for Margaret to open her own life too. Those murmurs felt like invisible daggers, questions whispered behind curtains, doubts echoing in the backdrop of her every step. One afternoon, Margaret arrived early at a small cafe where she and David used to meet for lunch, hoping for a quiet moment of solace. Instead, she found him already seated, flushed with youthful enthusiasm, speaking to a woman whose smile held a need for validation Margaret hadn't realized had been missing between them. The sight snagged in her throat like a noose tightening slowly, David's hand brushing accidentally, or perhaps intentionally, against the young woman's arm, fingers lingering like a promise. The pain of that silent betrayal was so vivid it rendered her motionless for a heartbeat, a shadow passing before her eyes, threatening to consume the fragile edges of her dignity. She wanted to turn away, to flee, but an invisible force kept her rooted to the spot, bearing witness to the quiet devastation of a life unraveling in fragments. Back home, the atmosphere thickened with unspoken tensions. Margaret's thoughts spun in a whirlpool of doubts and insecurities, lyrics of old love songs now sounding like cruel reminders of what had been lost. She caught herself searching for signs of guilt or regret in David's eyes, but found only a glint of impatience or boredom, as if her pain was a nuisance rather than a shared burden. In those moments, the humiliation transformed into bitter loneliness, a cold companion sitting beside her during long, sleepless nights. The warm embrace of the past seemed a lifetime away, replaced by a penetrating cold that seeped into her bones, an aching sense that her identity, once so entwined with her role as wife and lifelong partner, was dissolving into air. The cruelest moment came unexpectedly during a dinner party hosted by close friends. David, with a careless charm on his lips, loudly described his plans for the future with the openness of a man unburdened by consequences. Margaret sat silently beside him, her hands clenched beneath the polished table, heart pounding painfully in her chest as whispers swelled like an unseen tide around her. The guests exchanged furtive looks, some offering sympathetic smiles, while others hesitated, unsure whether to reach out or look away. Her humiliation was displayed as painfully as if she were one of those fragile, decorative porcelain figurines, admired for how beautifully she had held herself together, but ultimately delicate and breakable, destined to shatter under the wrong touch. Margaret's mind raced, reliving every moment with harsh clarity. Could she let this erosion continue? Was silence her only option? Or would speaking up only widen the fracture? Her soul quivered in the shadow of a decision she wasn't ready to make, but knew she couldn't avoid much longer. She wondered who she was beneath the years of roles and expectations, whether that woman still existed or had been swallowed whole by the tidal wave of change washing over her life. Even as despair gathered in tight knots within her chest, a stubborn flicker of defiance burned deep beneath, ignited by the memory of her own strength and the promises unspoken to herself in moments alone. Had you ever felt your whole world tilt under the weight of harsh truths and wondered where the line lay between endurance and surrender? Sometimes, the hardest battles are fought quietly within, before the world even knows they've begun. What would you do if faced with such a fracture in the fabric of your life? Margaret found herself trapped in a fog that clouded both her mind and heart, a labyrinth of painful emotions where clarity was elusive and hope appeared remote. The cruel public subtlety of her humiliation, the whispered judgments, the pitying glances, had erosion but no closure. Day by day, she wrestled with a heavy solitude that pulsed in the silence of her empty bedroom. The absence of David's warmth, a chilling reminder of their unraveling bond. Her breath often hitched in the stillness, a physical ache born not only from heartbreak, but from the dense thicket of unasked questions and unanswered pleas echoing in her mind. Each passing day wrapped around her like unwelcome fog, thickening her sense of loss and drowning out the woman she used to be. Some mornings, Margaret woke feeling so utterly erased that she doubted whether she could bear another sunrise colored by betrayal. The face staring back at her from the cracked bathroom mirror was unfamiliar. Eyes tired and lined with worry, lips tight as if biting back silent cries. Had all those years been enough? Could love truly fracture so completely without warning signs? Attempts to reach out to friends were met with awkward silences or perfunctory support that felt distant, as if they couldn't fully grasp the depths of her sorrow or the complexity of her growing disillusionment. She found herself retreating into the shadows of her home, curling beneath layers of blankets or losing herself in old photo albums, tracing the smiles of better days with trembling fingers, longing for reassurance that the spark within her hadn't been extinguished forever. In those isolating moments, Margaret's thoughts turned inward, spiraling through memories, regrets, and what-ifs. What if she had noticed the signs earlier? What if she had fought harder for their marriage? And what if the foundation she'd built everything upon was nothing more than sand beneath her feet, ready to slip away with the slightest upheaval? The weight of self-doubt pressed down relentlessly, whispering poisonous doubts that she wasn't enough, not vibrant, not interesting, not desirable anymore. Yet beneath the pain, an ember glowed quietly, fueled by the residues of past resilience and the unspoken promise she once made to herself that she deserved respect, love, and a life unbound by humiliation. It was during one of these bleak evenings, when despair threatened to overwhelm her entirely, that an unexpected beacon appeared. An email, unassuming in its arrival, from Nora, a woman Margaret hadn't heard from in decades, pierced the gloom. Nora had been her closest friend during college, the sister she'd never had, and someone who had always seen beyond Margaret's shy exterior to the fierce heart beneath. The message was simple but urgent, a heartfelt check-in, a gentle reminder that some ties withstand time, and an invitation to reconnect, to breathe new life into old dreams and unspoken hopes. That single note stirred something dormant, a flicker of possibility that perhaps a new chapter, one written on her terms, was within reach. Encouraged, Margaret accepted the invitation to meet Nora for coffee, the familiarity of their shared history wrapping around her like a comforting shawl. Over warm mugs and old laughter, Nora listened without judgment and spoke of a world beyond whispered betrayals and inflicted humiliations. A world where dignity, reinvention, and healing were not only possible but deserved. In Nora's presence, Margaret felt the first cracks of ice around her heart begin to thaw, replaced by small rises of courage and a tentative hope that this was not an ending but a beginning disguised as pain. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a tentative smile, an acknowledgement that the journey ahead might be harsh, but not impossible to navigate. Yet even as this fragile light blossomed within, Margaret's path forward was anything but certain. Shadows of doubt still clung tenaciously, threatening to pull her back into the abyss whenever she faltered. The acts of courage, finding her own voice, setting boundaries, imagining a life apart, felt like tentative footsteps on unfamiliar ground. But with each small victory came renewed strength and an awareness that reclaiming herself would be messy and nonlinear. How could she redefine who she was when everything she had built seemed to crumble around her? And more importantly, who would she become if she refused to surrender to the pain? Have you ever stood at the edge of solitude and fear, wondering if the light at the end was hope or just another shadow? It is in these fragile moments that the first whispers of transformation begin. What if sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves, just to take the very first step toward freedom? The night Margaret had dreaded finally came, a night etched into her memory with the sharpness of shattered glass. After a long day steeped in the quiet hope sparked by reconnecting with Nora, she returned home to find the undeniable proof of David's betrayal laid bare in a way that left no room for denial or second-guessing. The message threads she accidentally stumbled on were no longer whispers on a phone screen. They were invitations sent in cold, calculated clarity. Plans made, promises whispered not to her, but to another. The woman was no longer an abstract name or a fleeting shadow, but real. Their laughter almost audible through the digital ether. The photographs exchanged, the secret world behind David's casual smiles. The weight of this revelation crushed her like a relentless tide, pulling her beneath waves of humiliation and despair so deep she gasped for air. She remembered standing in the dim light of their living room, the house eerily silent except for the pulsating rhythm of her frantic heart. Her hands trembled as she closed the phone, the screen's glow fading, but the cold burn of betrayal igniting with unyielding fury inside her chest. For a moment, she considered retreating into the shadows of grief, allowing despair to consume her completely. Yet beneath that raw pain, an ember of clarity sparked. This was the lowest point, the absolute bottom where surrender seemed inevitable, but where seeds of transformation could be sown. The years of love, loss, and endurance had woven into her a strength she hadn't yet acknowledged. If this was the darkest night, then dawn was bound to follow. As the following days unfolded, Margaret's pain seemed to ripple outward, witnessed and whispered about by those who watched from the edges of their social circles. But then, Unexpectedly, the narrative took a turn that startled not only her, but everyone around her. Instead of crumbling beneath the weight of humiliation, she began quietly asserting herself. It started with simple acts, setting boundaries, refusing to engage in arguments that drained her spirit, focusing instead on rediscovering small joys that had long been neglected. When David confronted her with arrogance, expecting submission, she met his gaze with a newfound steadiness that disarmed him. At home, the once harrowing silence evolved into charged space where words could no longer wield the power they had before. The real turning point arrived on a chilly afternoon when Nora, ever perceptive, suggested they attend a workshop for women recovering from relationship trauma. Margaret hesitated, thoughts swirling with doubt and fear, but the invitation was extended with tenderness, a lifeline tossed into her turbulent sea. She accepted. Stepping into a room filled with strangers whose stories mirrored her own, women bruised but unbroken, each carrying scars and hope intertwined. The raw vulnerability in that space, the power of shared stories and reclaiming voices long silenced, became a balm for her wounded soul. Here, Margaret realized the extent to which humiliation and hurt could be transformed into fierce pride and renewed purpose. In one of the sessions, when she spoke for the first time about her journey, her voice trembled but held an undeniable strength. The group listened, their eyes reflecting understanding and solidarity, and something shifted inside her, a spring of courage that poured forth like a river breaking freer. She began to plan her escape, not just from David, but from the pain and the identity tied to years of subservience. While the prospect was terrifying, Margaret's heart beat with a rhythm of liberation. David, once so assured, was now confronted with a woman who refused to be defined by his desires or betrayals. The reactions around her were a mix of shock and curiosity. David's arrogance faltered. The woman with whom he thought she would never contend found her footing with grace and unyielding strength. Even neighbors and friends paused to witness the transformation, their whispers turning from pity to admiration. Margaret's unexpected resilience became a quiet rebellion, a beacon casting light on the possibility of victory, even in the face of deep wounding. The humiliation she once bore became the foundation from which she rose, stronger and clearer in purpose. In those moments, Margaret understood that true strength is forged not by avoiding pain, but by facing it head-on and choosing to rise. Her journey was far from over, but the first blazing steps toward freedom had been taken. What if sometimes the lowest points are just the fertile ground where the strongest roots grow? Does the end of a story always mean defeat, or can it herald the beginning of a new, powerful chapter? How might you find your own way back from the darkest nights? Maybe, like Margaret, your escape is just the start of your greatest transformation. Have you ever experienced a moment when hitting the bottom became the catalyst to rise higher than you ever imagined? If so, remember that sometimes the greatest power comes from embracing your pain and choosing to rewrite your story. The confrontation Margaret knew was inevitable finally arrived like a storm breaking over a fragile coastline. Unpredictable, yet utterly unstoppable. The space between her and David crackled with the weight of years unsaid. Betrayals unearthed, and wounds tender but fiercely alive. David, once so dismissive of her pain, now sat across from her in their dimly lit living room, the usual air of entitlement in his posture replaced by a flicker of unease. He had expected submission, perhaps tears, or even silence, but Margaret met him with a steadiness that betrayed the months of quiet fortitude she had gathered. Her voice, clear and unwavering, laid bare the depths of his betrayal, not just the open marriage proposal, but the layers of disregard and disrespect that had eroded their connection. The house that had once been a sanctuary now bore witness to a reckoning long overdue. Throughout the confrontation, Margaret held her ground while waves of emotion surged through her. Hurt, anger, but also a newfound power that came from reclaiming her narrative. She spoke not only of what David had done, but, just as importantly, of the woman she refused to be any longer. Each sentence was a declaration of independence, a step toward reclaiming the self she had almost lost beneath years of compromise and silence. David's defensive veils fell away under the weight of her unwavering gaze, and the man who had once charted their future without her input was forced to face the truth of her strength and resolve. For the first time in decades, the scales between them shifted, and the balance tipped in a way that surprised even Margaret herself. The consequences of that night rippled swiftly and unmistakably through their lives. David's attempts to maintain control faltered as Margaret took clear steps to establish boundaries she had only recently begun to comprehend and embrace. Legal consultations, financial independence efforts, and honest conversations about the future were no longer whispered hopes. They became concrete plans, anchored by her determination. Friends and family, once caught in the crossfire of unspoken conflicts, now stood beside her, offering support informed by the clarity of her conviction. The invisible chains of years began to crumble as Margaret's voice grew louder, not in anger, but in the quiet, steady power of someone who had reclaimed her story. Meanwhile, David faced the consequences of his choices sooner than anticipated. The aloof confidence he displayed before gave way to isolation and a reckoning with the reality that loyalty and respect cannot be bought or bargained for. As Margaret flourished in her newfound independence, his world narrowed, the void he had created consuming the space he once claimed so effortlessly. The humiliation he had inflicted upon her began to circle back, amplified by the unmistakable fact that the woman he had taken for granted was no longer bound by his shadow. Margaret watched, not with vindictiveness, but with the calm satisfaction of a survivor who had transformed pain into power and rejection into liberation. As the weeks passed, Margaret found herself evolving beyond the role she thought defined her, wife, mother, caretaker, to embrace the woman whose strength had been forged in fire. She reconnected with dreams shelved long ago, exploring passions in art and writing that stirred her soul anew. Each brushstroke, each word written, became a testament to her rebirth, a tangible affirmation that her worth extended far beyond the confines of her former life. The echoes of humiliation remained, but they no longer dictated her identity. Instead, they served as reminders of how far she had come. Her journey was not a tale of defeat, but a triumphant saga of resilience, courage, and profound transformation. Do you recall a moment when you stood firm against forces trying to diminish you, and through that stand, discovered a strength you never imagined? Margaret's story teaches us that reclaiming our power isn't just about confrontation. It's about embracing our own value fully and refusing to be diminished by others' choices. What battles in your life demand that kind of courage? How might taking control of your story change the course you thought was predetermined? If you've ever felt buried beneath others' expectations or betrayals, but found the courage to rise, take a moment and recognize that your strength is real and transformative. Standing up for yourself is not only an act of justice, but of deep self-love. Months after the storm of confrontation had passed, Margaret found herself standing on the threshold of a life she had once thought impossible. The quiet mornings now carried the scent of fresh possibilities rather than stale regrets. Her home, once a backdrop to whispered betrayals and silent suffering, had become a canvas for new dreams, painted with vibrant colors of hope and purpose. Each day she woke with a sense of calm strength. A woman redefined not by what had been taken from her, but by all she had reclaimed, her dignity, her voice, her freedom. The journey had been arduous, dotted with moments of doubt and pain, but the woman she saw in the mirror was no longer the shadow of a betrayed wife, but a beacon of resilience and wisdom. Her relationships, once bound by expectations and regrets, transformed too. With David, she carved out a new space, no longer as wife, but as two individuals who had charted separate paths, both shaped by the past, yet no longer defined by it. Friendships deepened around her, cultivated through honesty and vulnerability, and she found joy in connecting with others who valued her for the woman she truly was. Margaret's daily routine evolved to include passions long buried, painting classes that ignited her creativity, writing workshops where her stories took flight, and quiet moments in nature where she listened to the gentle pulse of her own heart. In these realms, she cultivated a profound sense of peace and belonging that no betrayal could undermine. What stood out most to those who had witnessed her fall and rise was the radiant grace she carried through the world. The humiliation and pain that had once threatened to consume her had instead refined her spirit, forging a courage that inspired others. At gatherings, neighbors and friends often remarked on her newfound glow, a light born not of complacency, but of fierce self-respect and hard-won self-love. Margaret became a quiet example of transformation, showing that sometimes the deepest wounds can blossom into extraordinary strength. The lessons she learned were etched not only in her words, but in the confidence that colored her every step, a testimony to the power of authenticity and the courage to start anew. Reflecting on her journey, Margaret recognized that the true victory was never about proving David wrong or reclaiming a lost marriage. It was about reclaiming herself. She learned that love, especially the most important kind, the love we give ourselves, is rooted in acceptance, forgiveness, and the freedom to grow beyond pain. The betrayal that once seemed like an earth-shattering collapse became a catalyst for liberation. Her story illuminated a universal truth. Our worth is not defined by others' actions, but by how fiercely and kindly we hold on to our own hearts. This realization was her true triumph, the foundation on which she built a life filled with hope, joy, and endless possibilities. Have you ever faced a moment that shattered old beliefs, only to reveal a deeper, more powerful version of yourself? Margaret's story reminds us that no matter how devastating the loss, the way forward is always through love, for ourselves and the new lives we create. When we embrace our worth authentically and courageously, we open the door to freedom and fulfillment beyond any measure. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button. See you in our next story.